Congressman, really appreciate your time today. Thanks for coming on. I know things are busy, so we really thank you very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure, Tom.
Let's start with the conflict right now in the Middle East with Iran. And there's been much made, especially in the aftermath, if you will, in terms of the intel, the conversation, what's even been reported. As you know, our profession has been under the radar, if you will. But I do want to go back to where this all started. And I know there's been the conversations about the president doing the strikes without congressional approval. So I want to ask you, because I know you voted to impeach, right? Earlier this week.
When we had a resolution that came forward, and there was a vote to table, but
Okay,
not on impeachment.
got it.
So,
Okay, just want to make sure we're clear on that before I ask the next question. If
yeah.
if it didn't, because I know that that's been the frustration, and that it happened without the approval of Congress, these strikes. If that did go to Congress, would you have voted to strike in these nuclear sites?
Well, certainly we would want to gather the information that would have brought about that the War Powers Act. So, I think basically what we've learned from this, and I can base it on this last week of discussion, is that we finally got a briefing. There were briefings scheduled that had been postponed. We finally got a classified briefing. But there are still very many questions. There are disagreements. The Defense Intelligence Agency is reporting other than President Trump is. He said we obliterated the area, and any kind of threats of uranium and nuclear response. I think, what that tells me is even after and I'm of course limited by, the classified briefing, but it tells me there are still major disagreements on just the interpretation of what had happened. But I think, drawing in Congress, having support, and especially now in the post activity, I think everyone can agree a nuclear empowered Iran is not something we want to see happen. And, for the safety of the Mid East, and certainly in defense of Israel to protect herself, it's important to move forward and come to a table to talk in diplomatic terms. I think it's so important for us to engage a number of diplomats into the region now that Iran has been weakened. And hooray for our military. They have been equipped and well trained and have technology on their side so that they did a phenomenal job. But, the fact that they, had moved some of the uranium supply, the fact that, there's disagreement on how much destruction occurred there. These are things that I think inspire the invocation of the War Powers Act, making certain that Congress is consulted. To date, this second term of the Trump presidency has been a complete circumvention of Congress, and the distinct powers of the branches of government cannot be denied. I think the checks and balances outcome here are very, very important. And so, recognizing from the executive perspective, the legislative branch and the judicial branch for that, you don't just impeach judges when you don't like their decision. All of that needs to be brought into working order so that we get the best results here. But the fact of the matter is that, I think people are concerned about the cost of another war. And we have to make certain that we do this again with all the information we can gather. I'm reminded of the situation with, the instruments of mass destruction that in the past, where they were invoked, and many people challenged the assessment back then of where we were with the technology that they cited, and it proved to be pretty faulty. And so we don't want to repeat that mistake again. And at the same time, keep in mind that we really want to make certain there is not a nuclear empowered Iran.
I was curious. Yeah, I was wondering why now, because I think that was maybe the situation back then, but for other political reasons, but also intelligence. In this case, and I'm sure you saw the clip on CNN of the compilation of Benjamin Netanyahu talking about Iran being weeks or months from having a full-blown nuclear program and being able to develop this that's been going on for decades. From the intelligence that you've been briefed on, I guess, was it that urgent at this point, or was there were there other geopolitical factors at play involving specifically Israel?
Yeah, I think we were listening to a lot of or the president was listening to a lot of the rhetoric coming from Mr. Netanyahu. And we at home had differing opinions being offered in very professional format of the situation in Iran. You know, you've got the Defense Intelligence Agency, a number of other agencies that can consult or be consulted here. And I think we needed to listen to that to make certain that we're going forward with the best strategy. And, hopefully we will now engage at the table of diplomacy, and we will encourage the diplomats from the greater region to be involved to build a good coalition. You know, we had the Iran nuclear agreement that was torn up and shredded by President Trump, and now we're probably getting back to that whole similar type of outcome.
It felt like this, and I'm going to look at this through holistically of, it went from Iran has a right to defend itself to the United States getting involved. And then you see also, if you then look at people use those terms when it came to Hamas and Iran having a right to defend itself there. Now, I want to now talk about something you mentioned when it came about a month ago in Troy during your town hall. I'm sure you've been asked about this since then, but referred to what's going on in Gaza as a genocide in terms of
Right.
Israel striking back at Gaza and against Hamas in that aspect too. Why did you refer that to as a genocide in that moment?
Well, much information is coming our way, and the carnage out there has been horrific. I certainly think that aiming your military force against the opponent is where it should be, not at innocent children and women who have been impacted, and they stand in line for food distribution. And a number of groups have referenced that as a genocide, and it really bothers me that the warring factors happens to be one thing, but when the target becomes innocent children and people on both sides, I mean Israelis and Palestinians, we have to make certain that we work to protect the innocent in this case.
I know
I
that.
know it's an emotional word, but we have utilized that terminology, certainly with the atrocities of the Holocaust, but also in situations in other areas, in Armenia, in Africa, and what have you. It just became a term that expresses, the impact on innocent individuals.
One of your colleagues on the Senate side, Kirsten Gillibrand, went on a radio show earlier this week talking about Zohran Mamdani in terms that have been used around him, maybe not necessarily ones that he used, but hasn't necessarily denounced. And the terms have carry a lot of weight. I'm not sure if you saw exactly what she said, but she was pretty staunch in saying, more conversations need to be had with him and what he believes. And then someone that's so prominent in New York State. I know your district's in Albany, but this is a New York Democrat and someone that obviously voters in New York rallied behind on Tuesday, as you could say. How do you feel about his views and policies and where that puts New Yorkers and
Right.
moving forward? Because he was part of that working families party that really
Yeah.
dominated the state.
Well, I think that the Assemblyman utilized technology to a great degree and his sophistication in working social media. But he also he messaged about the essentials that we know people were thinking about during the last presidential campaign. And while it was addressed um, perhaps in a disingenuous way by the president's campaign, I think our concerns should have been better shared with the American public. And I think he did that. He talked about housing costs. He talked about the grocery bills. He talked about utility costs. These basic things that families sit down at the dinner table and express concern about. And I think he very, very ably expressed his desire to make a difference with those given dynamics. And, the people have spoken. I mean, you had a huge turnout, and evidently the message resonated with the public of New York City.
Do you have any concerns about these claims of anti-Semitism?
Well, look, anti-Semitism is unacceptable in any format. And, I always will stand against anti-Semitism. Always have and always will. But, we move forward. And if the case comes that there needs to be a forceful expression against some of the statements, we'll be there.
You talk about the reaction from both sides of the aisle. I've seen a Republican from Tennessee in Congress have what people are calling Islamophobic posts about Zohran Mamdani, calling him Little Muhammad and saying these things. I guess, how do you react to that?
Well, we continue to grow as a nation of diversity. The pluralism of our society, from race to ethnicity to creed to you name it, needs to be respected. And we, again, as a nation that has harbored a lot of hopes and a lot of opportunity, we need to continue that capacity and, making certain that individual rights are not violated, that individual rights are protected, and that we go forward in living in a peaceful sort of coexistence and where we encourage respect of these various blocks in our culture.
Should Andy Ogles be like censured for that? Should he be reprimanded for using that? I mean, there's been several posts.
I
He's
think that's sort of,
a meme about it.
the ill of social media is the heated rhetoric that people will promote out there. And unfortunately, there are followers. But I tell people all the time, research, validate. Don't take this stuff for the given absolute truth. Verify and go forward. And gosh, we can do so much by toning down the rhetoric.
Yeah, they can be alarming, and in a lot of ways. We get to the economics, I guess, portion now of the conversation. I guess I'll present something that has been part of Zohran's policy. You talk about affordability, and he wants a lot of stuff for free, I guess you could say, and doing that by taxing the rich, taxing billionaires. And I think you've called for a drop of that billionaire tax cut in the one big, beautiful bill, right? At the end of the day, would that be a part of the solution is kind of flipping it on its head, just in long term,
Well,
the policy, would it make more sense to help pay for some of these things like, the Medicaid and all these essential services by doing something different with taxing instead of cuts? Maybe that's the first step at the end of the day, right?
well, you look at the big, beautiful bill, which I've labeled big, ugly bill, because there's nothing beautiful about taking healthcare away from 16 million people or requiring states to now contribute for the first time toward hunger programs. And I think that cutting that nutrition program by 320 billion, asking the poorest to pay more every time they go to see a doctor, paying a surcharge even though they're covered with insurance. All of this has added up to a lot of consternation, a lot of concern, a lot of struggle. And you look at this thing in its components. And so they cut trillions out of programs, denying people health care, denying nutrition programs, denying an innovation economy, the initiatives that were introduced, rebates and investment tax credits, production tax credits, wiping that away. So we don't grow our economy. We remove health care from millions, tens of millions of people, and then we borrow. Here's deficit hawks conforming to deficit hacks to say, okay, green light to borrowing. So you cut programs deeply that are very much day-to-day requirement. You borrow significantly, all to pay for a tax cut primarily for billionaires. All of this, the good news here is we can stabilize our economy, strengthen our programs, begin to address the deficit, all if we don't have a billionaire tax cut. And I think it's a good thing. It's a good outcome. Why we're insisting, I know they're friends of the administration. They contributed heavily. But my gosh, what's best for the nation here? We can make, I think, the most sensible outcome. You look at how very narrow the support was by one vote. The big, beautiful passed in the House. It goes to the Senate. And now they're adding to Medicaid cuts. I think some of them are doing that because they don't want to borrow as much as our House bill did. But whatever the reasons, you're inflicting more pain of a different kind. And now I understand discussions have broken down. And so the July 4th deadline, which is self-imposed by the president, may not be met. But let's do what's right and not rush into this situation that is offering tax cuts first and foremost. And then the way to do it is to starve off programs that the great many of us utilize. You know, the hospitals, so many rural hospitals are covered by a Medicare, Medicaid revenue stream. And Medicare gets cut by a half a billion, a half a trillion, and Medicaid gets cut by 800 to 900 billion. You're trillions of dollars worth of cuts to healthcare. There's no way you can't impact the accessibility, the affordability of healthcare for a great many. And that's not going to go away as a concern. We're going to pay for it through our rates because they'll go to emergency rooms. They won't be paying because the situation is all are served. It then filters into bad debt and charity and then finds itself into your insurance rates. So let's do the smart and sensitive thing. And if we don't have the money for that billionaire tax cut, just let's march forward.
When it comes to Medicaid, is there a percentage that, I mean, obviously this is a negotiation in the Senate right now, and you can only do so much, but for you to live with, if you had it your way, is there a percentage of these cuts you'd be okay with, knowing that there is some of the fraud, there is some people that are taking advantage of the system? Is it 10% of what is being in there?
Is it true? Did they ever show the abuse? There was never an address of abuse, waste, and fraud. What they did, Tom, was cut programs, discard the programs. They never fixed them. They never said, okay, here's the more efficient outcome. The efficiency, the waste, the fraud was never addressed. It was just outright denial of programs. And
Yeah, because
you know when
we get notifications from Attorney General all about some of this stuff, about when someone is taking advantage of these programs, right? That's who, at least from our perspective, is telling us
and
where that's occurring, right?
right, right, and they're doing their job. We
Right.
have had welfare fraud, public health, Medicaid fraud programs passed, and the implementation is how you address the waste and the fraud. And it is working. In states where, like Arkansas and Georgia, where they implemented the work program, they found that it was a total failure. It added to administrative burden. There were forms lost. There were people who, are at home that are unemployable. There are seniors who can't get a job and they still need health care coverage. There's many situations that uh, are taken consideration of, and I just think that this whole effort to undo this many people with their health care. I mean, for me, it's some 28,000 people in the congressional district. It's not the way, we didn't address the waste and the fraud. We just said, cut the program pell-mell. And we have programs that review fraudulent behavior, and it's to them to continue to work away at that.
It does seem to be a theme of this administration. I mean, we can't we don't have time to touch on immigration right now, but it is a very umbrella swath of an approach because we've seen American citizens be detained and in some cases deported without due process, and we've
Yeah,
seen individuals without crime. I think I just saw reports out of California, LA, where there's several people that have never committed a crime in the United States that would
I
level.
saw reports that as little as 6%
Yeah.
of people who have been part of the expulsion. I won't even say deportation because they haven't been given legal opportunity, the habeas corpus opportunity to prove their innocence. So that expulsion has found 6% of people who had criminal records. When you're operating off of a quota, the assumption is that you've got 6,000 people that day that are there, and they're sweeping hospitals, they're sweeping schools, and finding that many innocent people have been impacted by this whole effort. It's been, the facts are really never exchanged, and at times I think that they're exaggerated. Which, when they use the term obliteration in the recent approach in Iran, it's always an extreme intensified outcome. And, the rhetoric doesn't match the work done to prove statistically what you're doing.
Yeah. That finally gets us to the end of the last part of this conversation, what comes with the judges and being able to work to provide injunctions to at least allow a process to go through. And now we've seen the Supreme Court say now the judges' power and federal judges' power are now limited to issue those nationwide injunctions. How does that factor into this conversation about everything we just talked about, really?
Well, it's a frightening decision, really. I mean, no right is safe, they're saying, in this new regime, not even the ones clearly guaranteed under our Constitution. We should all take this court decision and be very concerned about it in limiting nationwide injunctions. The Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, has once again prioritized loyalty to President Trump over defense of the Constitution. And our Constitution is our rule book, right? It is our guiding grace in this democracy, and it's being tampered with. And I think, again, it's another attempt to wipe out a number of situations, human rights that have been fought for throughout our history, and our whole charge by the framers of our government was we the people in search of a more perfect union. Well, all that search for perfection is being rolled back. And the case today is one of great disappointment.
Congressman, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Okay, my pleasure, Tom.